Kevin, for creating this space. I'm humbled and grateful to be here. I'm going to share so I placed in the chat, and I'm going to place it again for anyone who just joined, a document. For me, it's really important to acknowledge that this is learning. There are folks, liberation workers and activists who have come before me that I have been humbled to learn from. And so as I reference some of the sources that I've learned from, I've also placed it in the document. We're also going to hit on a lot of things here, and with the sort of norm of non-closure, because in an hour, there's just not enough time to get into all the things. And so I've provided as well some additional learning to some of the things that I'd like to share based on my experience in this work. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with y'all, because otherwise I am a rambler. So it's nice for me to have a PowerPoint, because it helps everybody stay focused. I have been in education for 10 years. 7 of those years have been in international schooling. And I want to talk a little bit tonight about the work that our schools can engage in facing white supremacy and anti-blackness, and hoping for radical liberation for all. A couple of things before we get started, and these are norms that I like to share because they're practices that I hope to engage in as I work in my work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion justice coach. One, just humility, and remember that this work requires lifelong learning. It is a key to constantly keep educating ourselves. There is no finish mark in the work of anti-racism. There is no, allyship is not a destination. You don't get there, you keep going. And so I like to kind of set that as a norm for us. And as well, remember that this is human work. These conversations are important, and I love this tweet by Lisa Ko, where she's talked about and as someone whose full-time job is diversity and inclusion trainings, I stand behind the revolution will not be diversity and inclusion trainings. These conversations are essential and important, but at the core, it is important to also remember that this is human work. We are talking about folks' humanity. We are talking about folks' right to live and exist free from the bondage of white supremacy. And so to over-intellectualize this work is dangerous, and it's performative. So as we engage in this conversation, be thinking about, how can I do more than just this conversation? And so those are just some norms that I hold myself to anytime I do any work or any webinars, and I wanted to share them with y'all. And just to frame some of the language that I'll be using as we talk, I'm going to talk specifically about anti-blackness, and I want to name that as the specific oppression. And this is a definition I borrow from the work of Rachel Cargill and the work of Ibram Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's the specific oppression faced by the Black community globally, the unique ways the Black community suffers racism that all people of color don't. Anti-Blackness is not a problem solely of white communities, but exists in other cultures as well. I use my 2 cultures there as an example. I am a Colombian Filipino woman, and the 2 things that my mother and father's cultures do have in common is anti-Blackness. And that is something that I, as a non-Black woman of color, have to sit with and reconcile with in my role in this work. I also will use the term BIPOC to sort of indicate those different experiences, Black, Indigenous people of color, as well as NBPOC, non-Black people of color. So just framing some of the language that I'll be using today in our conversation. And yeah, so I think the essential question for international schools, and I recently watched, and in the workbook that I shared with y'all, I have a couple of different sources there from Sonia Renee Taylor. I encourage you to check those out, but she talks about in one of her videos, asking the question, what is my investment in whiteness, might be a question that gets us all free. And I want to frame our conversation today as that being the essential question for international schools. What is our investment in whiteness? How have we invested in whiteness, and how can we examine that and start to de-invest? And so one of the first things, and there's going to be some space, I'd like to use breakout rooms today to allow us to deepen our conversation through engaging with one another. So I am going to be sharing some things, and then we'll go into some breakout rooms. When I think about our investment in whiteness in international schools, one of the first things in my work I've seen a lot of schools, a lot of school leaders talk about, I want to help. And especially right now in this conversation, there's this momentum in the wake of the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the conversation happening in the US. And you're hearing a lot of folks say, I want to help. I want to help address this issue of racism. And one of the things that we as international educators have to internalize is that we need to let go of help and focus on dismantling. The reality is that international schools are a child of colonialism. We cannot negate that truth. We exist as a byproduct of colonialism. And so therefore, as a byproduct of colonialism, the narrative of white supremacy and anti-blackness are undeniable. They are, as we exist as children of colonialism, as these schools exist as a way to maintain colonial powers, whether that was 70, 80, 50 years ago, whenever your school was founded, that means that the narrative of white supremacy and anti-blackness came as a byproduct of that. And so as a result, when I talk about white supremacy, I talk about that sense of birth. I've been on earth for 33 years, and all 33 of those years, I have received messages that have conditioned me to see whiteness as the goal, as the norm. And when I talk about anti-blackness, I talk about the fact that in order to maintain that myth, in order for the myth of whiteness as the goal, as the superior norm, we have also been conditioned to see Black people as less than human. There's quite a few sources that I've provided there in the workbook that talk about the dehumanization of Blackness, of Black bodies, of Black people, as well as some terms I invite you to Google to learn further about this. But the reality is that this goes quite deep. This goes deep, deep into our psyches, and all of us are affected by it. To frame this a little bit more, I like to talk about this conversation using the 4 I's. The system of white supremacy is ideological. What that means is that there's these ideas of whiteness that we have been conditioned to believe. And that translates into our interpersonal relationships. Those are the moments where racism happens between two people, between a group of people. When that person is in a position of power in order to enact their racism, we're talking about institutionalized. That goes from, if I'm sitting with anti-Blackness and I perpetuate racism to a colleague of mine, that's interpersonal. When I am in position to hire, to make curriculum decisions, to determine professional learning, and I have not unpacked my bias, I have not begun to dismantle my own anti-Blackness, my own investment in whiteness or in white supremacy, then I am now enacting institutionalized oppression. And then there's also the 4th I is internalized, which is the ways that the IPOC folks have racism, internalized racism within us because of the ideological, interpersonal, and institutionalized systems that exist. And so I use those 4 I's because I think it's important as we begin as international schools to think about this work. We have to think about it not simply as one category or one approach. White supremacy is a 400-year-old system that has had 400 years to perfect itself. And so our approach then must also be systemic. It also has to look at all of the ways in which racism lives in our ideology, in our curriculum, in our belief systems that we set up in our schools, in our interpersonal, in the relationships amongst staff, in the institutionalized, in the policies and hiring practices of our schools, and in the internalized. And so some thoughts on what it means to move forward with that hard truth. And this is, again, just from my experience in my work in diversity and justice work. One is when we think about our role in international schools, I think the question has to shift from how do we help to what is our school's commitment to studying and interrogating white supremacy? What does our school's commitment look like? And what does that mean in terms of accountability to staff? How are we holding our staff accountable to this work? And how are we providing them the space to do it? Secondly, I think, and this is Ibram Kendi's work, how are we monitoring where the cancer lives? He talks about white supremacy and racism as a cancer. And it's a metaphor that stuck with me. I've lost a parent to cancer. My mother recently was declared cancer-free after battling with cancer for a year. And I think about the treatments that my parents went through. It was urgent. There was immediate surgery. We need to get in there. We need to get the tumor out. And then it was proactive. My mom had surgery, then she had chemotherapy, then she had radiation. And it is also consistent. She has to go in every 3 months for checkups to monitor this cancer. And Ibram Kendi talks about racism as that same cancer. It has to be urgent. There are policies and things that we can change, but it also has to be proactive and consistent. Because as I already mentioned, the 400-year head start that white supremacy has in developing its system means that our attack against white supremacy systemically has to be both urgent, proactive, and consistent. So, there's Kendi. I don't know if y'all can hear, there is constantly music on my street that I live on. And so if y'all can hear that, I apologize. Can you still hear me? Can I get a kind of a thumbs up? Okay. Where I live, the street that I live on in Colombia, people are out there hustling and playing music. And so it's kind of a constant here. I can't really avoid. So where was I at? I just got lost by this bachant. Okay, so we're talking about our commitment to this work and interrogating that. And another, I always like to kind of take a pause here. And when I talk about interrogating white supremacy, I want to make a special note for folks who identify as non-Black people of color, like myself. We have to be hyper vigilant about how white supremacy lives in us too. The algorithm of white supremacy works as such that we have been fed the narrative that if we can align ourselves to whiteness, we're going to gain some of the social capital that comes with whiteness. And in order to do that, we then carry anti-Blackness within us. And it's important to be hyper vigilant of this in our work as non-Black people of color. I know that there are, in this work, there is always going to be the temptation to center ourselves. I think of a pop culture reference. If you don't know who Gina Rodriguez is, she is a Latinx actress, and she has a unfortunate history of constantly centering herself as Black folks fight for their liberation, and not reconciling her own anti-Blackness. I remember when Black Panther came out, she was on Twitter talking about, well, when is there going to be a Latino Black Panther, which one, erases Black folks from the Latinx community, and two, Black folks are not the reason that non-Black people of color are suffering under white supremacy. White supremacy is the reason that non-Black people of color are suffering under white supremacy. And so this competition that sometimes happens, we have to be hyper vigilant about in how white supremacy lives in us too, because I sometimes fear how these conversations become whiteness and white supremacy, and that lives in me too. As a Filipino and Colombian woman, I have to constantly reconcile that. And so that note I always want to make as we enter into this work. So thinking about that was just a lot of information. And I think it's always good to kind of stop and process. I'd like to move us into some breakout rooms. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And if you're in the workbook, I put this question in the workbook, and as well as I put some examples of what white supremacy might look like in our schools. One of the examples I put is colonial symbolism. I work at the Columbus School in the country of Colombia. We have colonial symbolism everywhere. And so this isn't an attack on your schools or an attack on the practices. It's an invitation to engage in interrogating and beginning to radically think about how we might interrupt those systems of white supremacy in our schools. And so I just kind of threw a lot of information, a lot of thoughts from my work in diversity and justice, and I think it might be good right now to kind of pause and reflect. So I'm going to use the breakout room function and ask that, as I mentioned those couple of things around white supremacy and anti-Blackness and those systems and how they live within our spaces, to talk in your groups about where they might live in your space, in your community, in your culture, in your curriculum. And like I said, in the workbook, I gave a couple of examples that might be a way to start the conversation. And I think about 7 minutes in these breakout rooms to kind of process and engage with one another. How's that sound?
These webinar things. So.
Welcome back, everyone. One of my members of my group got cut off mid-conversation, and so I apologize for that. I bet a lot of folks did, because 7 minutes really is a short amount of time, but I did want to give us some space to process. For me, I do, when I engage in these conversations, I think folks, and we're seeing that right now, we're seeing that with the global conversation happening with the resurgence of the BLM movement in the wake of these deaths. There's a knee-jerk reaction to jump to solutions. And I always want to pull folks back and say, well, do you understand the root of the problem first? Do you understand first where white supremacy lives, where anti-Blackness lives in your space, in your community, and to examine that as a part of the solution building process. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Oh, that's not the screen I want y'all to see. Let me figure, oh, there we go. So we were just here reflecting, thinking about, how has whiteness been normalized and white supremacy? And I want to kind of talk on another piece. As we think about solutions, as we, as a international school community, start talking about solutions, I think it's important to acknowledge that somebody has already told on whiteness. What do I mean by that? I mean that it is not, the BIPOC struggle in international school struggle is there. It is real. It was likely ignored. Someone has told on whiteness in our communities. Someone has told on whiteness. Someone is telling on whiteness in our local communities. One thing that is really important for me as I engage in this work in Colombia is to know that I am part of the problem if I am not actively working or seeking out partnership with Afro-Colombian activists, because they've been telling on whiteness long before I decided to relocate to Colombia, long before I decided to engage in this work and return to my mother's land. And it's important to listen to those voices who have been in this work. And what that might look like and what that might mean is really being conscious as we move forward as who is being positioned as experts in this work and who we are learning from. I'm already seeing some slightly nerve-wracking knee-jerk reactions to this resurgence, like I said, of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we need to be conscious of who we are positioning as experts in this work, and listen to our BIPOC staff. And that doesn't mean that it is the responsibility of BIPOCs to educate oppressors on their oppression. This doesn't look like going to the first Black staff member being like, so is it racist here? You think it's racist here? It is not their responsibility to ask Black folks to relive trauma for our learning. That is white supremacy also in action. But it means to listen to the voices that have already spoken, looking at exit interviews, examining, looking at your staff, looking at conversations that have already been happened that maybe had been brushed aside, because oftentimes in the international school community, there's this notion that we can't be racist, we're international. There's no racism here. And so going back and first remembering that somebody has told on whiteness. I've provided a couple of articles there that if you haven't, there was a beautiful article written by a teacher, an open letter to search associates on, I don't know if y'all have seen that one floating around. And then in a session I was in last week, a participant shared another article with me that I added to the workbook, written by a Black student about his experience as a Black member of the community in Bucharest. I think it's a beautiful read, and it helps highlight that point that somebody has told on whiteness and we need to listen. I also want to encourage us as we move forward in this work to be really conscious of the history of white saviorism. I think it's important to recognize that there is a history, it's in our curriculums, it's in our storytelling, and this goes back to my first point of releasing this notion of help and moving into the notion of dismantle. Oppressed folks don't need to be helped. They need the systems that oppress them to be burned to the ground. They don't need help. They need these systems burned to the ground. And so being conscious as we think about who might be leading this work in our communities, the history of white saviorism and our role and responsibility in questioning that as Western privileged folks. Like I said, something that I have been trying to hold myself accountable to that I didn't do well in my first years of this practice is partnering with existing local communities who are in this work, who have been speaking, who have been asking to be seen and heard, the indigenous communities, the Afro-Colombian communities. And if I come in as a Western savior and be like, oh, but I got this, I am part of the problem. And so being really conscious of that history of saviorism, and constantly monitoring the temptation to center white comfort over Black liberation. This work is uncomfortable. It should be. It is uncomfortable, and as we have seen play out over the last 400 years, often deadly to live under racism. So to dismantle it, if discomfort is the least that we have to endure, we must endure it. And I oftentimes, I've worked with a couple of schools and I get this, well, how is this gonna look with our difficult parents? And I find that difficult is often coded for, you mean semi-racist parents? And if we are centering their semi-racist discomfort, then we're really not interested in liberation. We're really not here for the work. And so really being vigilant and monitoring where in our spaces we are centering comfort over liberation. This work is intended to be uncomfortable. It will be uncomfortable, and committing to that discomfort is part of the process. And just thinking about, we all have roles in how we engage, and because, and I said it before, it's a 400+ year system in the making. White supremacy has perfected itself. It has integrated itself in everything, in the 4 eyes. And so our approach must be in the 4 eyes. How are we looking at dismantling this? Sorry, y'all. I apologize. I have a very bored pit bull. Quarantine has not been kind to her, and she is just a little bit rambunctious in the house. So yeah, really thinking about how our work addresses the 4 eyes, and how we all have roles to engage in this commitment to anti-racism. And so I think because I actually want to share a couple more things and then allow Kevin and Dr. Ashley to close, I'm going to skip this reflection and just ask us to reflect internally on what action steps might our schools take. I was going to move us into breakout rooms, but I think I'm going to pause on that and keep kind of moving forward with some things that I'd like to share, thinking about time. So some final thoughts on international schools and anti-racism. One thing that I think is really important to remember, and a lot of folks have asked me, just in my work with schools here in Colombia, I get a lot of, well, what do we do now? Well, what can I do now? Or what does this look like now? And my first answer is always commit, commit. This has to be something, we can't forget history while living in this moment. And when I say forget history, I say we can't forget they assassinated King, they slaughtered Hampton, they exiled Asada, they demonized Angela Davis, they demonized the Panthers. Every time Black folks have chosen to rise up for their liberation, the system comes down twice as hard. The system comes down twice as hard in fear of losing that power and that status quo and that norm. So the first thing I always say to folks when they ask me, so Alysa, Callie, I might keep going. If you can't hear me, let me know. There's just 3 other pit bulls that live in this building, and anytime one walks by one's door, it's chaos. I apologize. So I think the first thing that I always say to folks is commit. Figure out what your commitment to this work looks like when it's not convenient, when it's not trending, when it inevitably gets uncomfortable, because I promise you that it will. I promise you that it will, because if it doesn't get uncomfortable, there's something wrong about your approach. One thing that I say to my students, I work with a student committee at my school, and I tell them, this is good work, but if it always feels good, we're doing something wrong. This is good work, the work is good, but if it always feels good, we have missed the mark somehow, because we are operating from privilege, and to dismantle white supremacy, to dismantle anti-Blackness means to sacrifice that privilege, to say this privilege does not belong to me. This privilege was given to me based off of the oppression of others. And so that should not feel good. And so we have to be committed to the work beyond when it's convenient, beyond when it's trending. And just kind of like a roadmap that I've been using in conversations with folks is the awareness, build, and commit. Awareness meaning, like I said, listen to your BPIC community. Go back and listen to those voices that might have been ignored. Look at those exit interviews. Look at where these conversations are existing in your local community. Partner with local institutions, local activists. Remember that there are folks who have been telling on whiteness before we decided to enter and engage in the work. Build systems. White supremacy is a system. It is a 400-year-old system, so we need systems to attack it. I am incredibly lucky that I have the opportunity at my current school to work with a student committee. They actually run probably 90% of the professional learning that I do at my school. I train them and then have them run the trainings. It's incredibly powerful when 2 17 and 18-year-olds are standing in front of my staff and saying, you're having a white fragility reaction. and actually calling folks in to learn and say, let me talk to you about what fragility is. Let me teach you about that. So building these systems, I work with my students. I work with parents. Not all of them are on board, but I do work with parents. I work with a committee of 17 teachers, asking one person, while my title is DEIJ, asking one person to engage in this work is a symptoms-based approach. It's to say, oh, racism is there, so let's treat the symptoms. No, it's not that racism is there. Racism is a symptom of the system of white supremacy, of the system of anti-blackness. So if we really want to dismantle that, we also have to create systems. I even, when I've been asked to do consulting work at schools, I've turned down one and done. I don't feel comfortable going into a school on a one and done model. I know that what they're looking for is a checkbox. Okay, we did a diversity talk. We hired someone to come in and do diversity talk. If their commitment to the work is, we're gonna bring you in once, my response is no. And so we have to really think about how our schools are willing to commit in building systems. And lastly, like I said, commit and get comfortable with this cycle. For me, this has been, particularly as a non-Black person of color who grew up around very, very white spaces, I spent a lot of my time feeling othered. My mother is white Colombian. My father is Filipino, very dark skinned. I'm this, and I grew up around a lot of white Colombians. And I spent so much time feeling othered that I didn't actually, until college, begin to dismantle white supremacy in myself, because I wasn't ready to reconcile that. And in my journey of anti-racism, part of that is the commitment to this cycle. I'm gonna learn about it, I'm gonna practice it, and I'm gonna mess up. And I apologize for the expletive. I thought I changed this slide because I used this one a few days ago with some students that I'm working with. But being comfortable with, I messed up, and I'm gonna keep learning. And I'm gonna keep learning, and I'm gonna use this as an invitation to continue learning and be in the moment. And remember that anti-racism is it's not an identity, it's not a title, it's a constant practice. Liz Kleinrock, who is a educator that I follow on Instagram, she refers to herself as a anti-bias, anti-racist educator in progress, because there's never a finish line. And I love that. And I think that has to be a commitment we also make to anti-racism. It is a constant practice. It is a constant cycle of learning. It's not a title or identity. Very quickly, because this tool I think is really helpful in this moment as the global conversation is upon us. This is not the best graphic, and I tried to find another one, but I provided some sources in the workbook, so y'all can engage a little bit in reading about the ring theory. As folks are starting to, whatever it is about this particular, whatever combination of compounded trauma has created this global conversation. George Floyd was not the first Black man to die on camera, and there are many who were not caught on camera, but whatever it is about this compounded trauma that has brought this conversation to the world, it's happening. And so one thing that I think it's important to recognize is that you are going to feel emotions in this work. Unlearning white supremacy is messy. It is messy. It will mess with your ego. It will mess with your sense of self. It will mess with so much of what has been established as our belief systems. And so for, specifically speaking to that mess, one of the things that I invite us all to do is get familiar with the emotions that will come so that we can name them, navigate them. The same way we ask our students to be, we engage in SEL. What is socio-emotional learning for our kids? It's knowing their emotions, naming them, and responding accordingly. And I think, so I've placed some resources in the workbook on fragility, on centering, on spiritual bypassing. I think these are some terms that we would all benefit from familiarizing ourselves with and understanding so that we can monitor those emotions. And then I also want to share here the ring theory, which is adapted by Suzanne Silk. And she actually wrote it for people suffering from medical trauma. And she talks about how do you manage trauma in dealing with the emotions that come from it when it's a trauma that's collective. And so she talks about centering the person in the closest to the ring is the person who experienced the trauma. Then, so in this particular, and the reason I chose this graphic, even though it's not great, is because it was modified for the conversation that's happening right now around the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's recognizing that the person in the center of the trauma was the Black person murdered by police. The next ring is the grieving loved ones, the immediate family. The next ring are Black folks globally who are re-triggered and triggered by the realization that they're of their own race-based trauma, the realization that just their skin color can get them killed. The next ring is non-Black people of color who experience different types of racism. The next ring is the vast spectrum of allies, white people who are intimately engaged with this work, who have been engaging with this work. And the point of the ring theory is that it is our responsibility to know where we are and to comfort in and to dump out. Meaning when I feel these emotions that are gonna come with unlearning my investment to whiteness, I need to know where I am in the ring and process those emotions with people either in my ring or outside of my ring. But I don't need to go in to people closer to the trauma. And I really love this tool because I think so many conversations are happening right now globally about dismantling white supremacy, about reconciling where anti-blackness lives in our society. And I think it's important to remember where we are in the ring of this conversation and to comfort in and to dump out. There's some resources there for y'all. And I also will close with this. This is the work of Dr. Bettina Love, Brittany Packett, Britt Hawthorne. All of those are in the workbook. This is their work that I learned from and I borrow from, which is, again, with white supremacy being a system and a system we want to dismantle, there are layers to this. There's layers to this work. We can be active allies, which means conversations like this one, which means educating ourselves. But we need to constantly be aspiring to what it looks like to be an accomplice or a co-conspirator, which is when the work becomes more than just, like I said, dangerously intellectualizing it. We can't just sit and talk about white supremacy while Black folks globally are trying to survive white supremacy. There's performativeness in that. And so we have to constantly be asking ourselves, what is my commitment to dismantle? What is my commitment to sacrifice in this work? And I think that they will do a much better job of explaining than I will. So I really invite you to, if you watch any of them, I really love the interview with Dr. Bettina Love, but watch them all. I think they're great to deepen our thinking around the layers of this work. And, oh, that's not what I wanted. And last but not least, am I still sharing my screen? Yes. Last but not least, I will use Paulo Freire to close. And he reminds us in his work of Pedagogy of the Oppressed that the humanity of all is at stake when we invest in oppression. And one of my favorite quotes of his is that no one can be authentically human while he prevents others from doing so. So as we begin to question what our investment in whiteness is in international schools, I also invite us to consider how an investment in whiteness is also an agreement to give up a part of our humanity. And it's an agreement to be less human because you cannot be authentically human while you prevent the humanity of others. And so I think that he says it so eloquently in his work, and I wanted to end there. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Ashley and Kevin.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. We're gonna open it up for a couple of questions, and then what Dr. Ashley and I are gonna put in, we're gonna show and share the screen real quickly. In the chat, we just put what was a part of the commitment to action that was in the International Educator document that we know many have read. I'm just gonna open that in a few, but we're gonna turn it over to, thank you, Abina, she's already put one. And if you wanna put something now, that's fine. If you want to take some time and revisit that and look at that, that's fine as well. I'm just gonna open it up just so that we can all get a image of what that looks like. And then Dr. Ashley, if you see any questions, you can add those. We can start to ask those. So give me 1 second, I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you all who are starting to reflect and share some commitments to action. All right, so here is, this was the last Thai International newsletter. And if you just scroll down towards the bottom, Dr. Ashley, I'm gonna have you read a few of those. We won't read all of them. You can scroll down, and then, like we said, we encourage all to, again, keep the conversation going, which is, like Alyssa was saying, talking about it as a journey. So Dr. Ashley, I'll turn over to you to read a few of those commitments, and then we're gonna turn over to questions that folks have for Alyssa.
Sure. All right. So I am trying to actually make.
Let me know if you can see my screen.
All right. There we are. So now is the time for us to move beyond contrived statements and to assert action to solidify our collective identity. Now is the time for us to seek the opportunity to learn and not to be silent. We therefore call on every stakeholder in the international education community to commit to action and make our community more socially just. What does the international education community need to do now? We commit to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter and the racialized experiences, though not a monolith of people of African descent, regardless of country of origin, are shared and felt. I'm actually going to read the last two. I think I actually want to pull out, along with kind of Alyssa's talk, is the fourth from the bottom, which is, we commit to challenge whiteness and even white supremacy in all its subtle and overt forms. For white educators, we acknowledge benefiting from privilege and structures of oppression against people of color. And we stand now to become part of the solution despite and in spite of current racialized incidents. We commit to become a part of the solution even when political and racial unrest are not at the forefront of the news cycle. Finally, since we ended on allyship a minute ago with that great graphic, I'm going to read the third to last one, which is, we commit to actively ally with, amplify, and mentor educators of color who come from all parts of the globe, aspire to be co-conspirators.
All right, I'll stop there. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And again, we encourage and invite everyone to visit that Padlet and to add your individual, collective, school, organizational goals. All right, so we're gonna look for questions, and feel free to type those into chat. I know I saw one. I'm gonna pull out one question for you, Alyssa. What would you say are some key indicators a school is doing good work in dismantling racism? How do we know? What do we look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one key indicator for me is vulnerability and honesty about the fact that it's there. I'm very cautious of schools who have a colorblind approach. The idea that, and I don't say that critically, I say that as it's a part of the system of white supremacy. It's part of what we're sold. I was talking in my small group about Colombia in particular. We have been sold the myth of mestizaje, this idea that because we've reached a blendedness, we are somehow a post-racial society. Yet and I shared this in the breakout room, I talk about Latinidad, or this concept of belonging to the Latinx community. Your Latinidad is contingent on looking like anything from Shakira to J-Lo. Those are your barriers. Anything darker than that, you're not really let into the club of Latinidad. And so I think a first indicator for me is a school's honesty about where white supremacy lives in their space. And acknowledging there is work to be done. Also acknowledging we have missed the mark in the past. We might have missed the mark. We might have failed our BPIOC educators in the past. I think that kind of vulnerability and honesty to me is something that I always look for. And then I look for receipts. I don't know how else to say it. I look at their curriculum. I look at their hiring practices. I look at their commitment to professional learning. I was, like I said, recently asked about doing some professional learning with a school that reached out to me, and their commitment was to one conversation. I'm not looking for, and I tried to redirect to say, can I do a training just with a small group of people, build a coalition, build a committee, whatever you want to call it, and we can, instead of doing a school-wide PD one time, might it look like to do some training with a small group within your community that can continue this work? When a school says, no, we just want, you to come in and talk to our school one time, that to me is an indicator of a lack of commitment to the work. And so when I say look at receipts, I mean, look at their plan for, ask for their plan for professional learning, ask for their curriculum, ask for their hiring practices, ask for their staff makeup. And we have a long way to go in terms of more diverse communities and international schools that include more BPIOC, but those are things that I ask about and I think about.
All right, questions are coming in. I'll see you all, so don't worry, we're pulling them. Here is one. How can the job fair hiring process be more equitable for educators of color?
I almost want to hand this one over to Dana because I've been working closely with her in the Diversity Collaborative and talking about what this process looks like. I mean, I think that when we think about the treatment of anti-racism as a cancer, there are some tumors that can be immediately removed. Non-native speaker or native speaker only being on resumes, pictures being required on resumes. That is, in a previous webinar that I was in with Dana, we talked about that was being an example of white privilege, knowing that your picture won't impact your hiring. I think, I recently saw a statement by Search and a statement by ISS, International School Services, looking to dismantle those expectations in their hiring process, taking out native speaker only, taking out pictures. And so I think that in the hiring process, there's those tumors that can be removed. When we think about the ongoing treatment, school leaders need to do implicit bias training. School leaders have to do implicit bias training. It is a battle that I've been having in my current community of how are we doing this work within our current staff? But then if our administration is going out and hiring with biases that they have not yet unpacked, then we're going to continue to bring in the same problem that we're trying to solve. And so I think that implicit bias training for school leaders is also a great way to help make the hiring process slightly more equitable.
All right, I'm bringing them in. What curriculum do you use to train students?
To train the students that I work with sorry to clarify on that question, like the curriculum we use for all school or the curriculum that I use for the students that I train to be leaders in this work?
Yeah, the latter, yeah.
It's kind of a blend of a lot of things. It's a requirement to be on the DEIJ student committee at my school. They have to take a 5-week course called Ally is a Verb. So it's a course that I've curated. I don't want to say I created because it's not a creation of my own, but it's a course that I've curated from lots of different resources that invite students to think about the ongoing process of allyship and what it means to be an aspiring co-conspirator. I'd be more than willing to share it because, like I said, it is not a creation of my own, but more curated curriculum. And all students who are interested in joining the student committee take the 5-week course before they're allowed to join the committee.
All right, here's another one. Okay, we found the implicit bias training. How do you think about the intersection between anti-racism and anti-fascism?
Well, that's Dr. Ashley, you want to take that one?
I believe in you, Alysa.
I mean, I think, go ahead.
No, I'll let you go ahead and I can kind of pinpoint.
Okay, I would love for you to jump in on this one. I think, I think it begins by also just dismantling this idea that education is not political. I think that the intersect of anti-racism and anti-fascism is hard to address because we still have so many folks who believe that politics don't belong in schools. Yet, and I will reference James Baldwin here. He wrote an essay called A Talk to Teachers, and he talks about the paradox of education. The paradox of education is that it inherently within a societal framework. So it belongs in being in a societal framework, it exists to uphold the framework of that society unless we intentionally question it. And James Baldwin was saying that in 1963 when he wrote that essay. It's 2020, the societal framework of white supremacy and anti-blackness, it still exists. And we see the manifestations of white supremacy and anti-blackness in fascist movements. So to me, anti-racism is a dismantling of fascism. You are going to struggle with that in communities because so many people are going to say, but politics don't belong in school. And to that, I reference James Baldwin.
I actually just finished reading that, which is so key. And I think one of the things, just to kind of piggyback a little bit too, is to think about this idea, the difference between equality and equity, and being able to really understand that equality is everyone having a pair of shoes, equity is everyone having a pair of shoes that fit. And so when we think about something like fascism, and this idea that there is one authoritarian way in which to rule, we understand that by nature is oppressive, right? And so being able to sort of dismantle those ideas. And I think one of the key things in Kendi's work around anti-racism is that you are not, so this is a concept that I think is difficult to grapple with, but also important. It's like, it's not that you are either racist or anti-racist. You are not racist, if that makes sense. And so just being able to kind of make that distinction, that in this work, it is critical to choose whether or not you are racist or anti-racist, but not kind of straddling the line as it relates to dismantling these systems.
All right, you all. And I know I want to keep this going. I'm watching time. There's a China group that's forming in chat. Again, keep it going. I'm going to pause us real quick. Again, I'll keep us on here all night long. You all don't understand, but I know some of us, it's the school day is starting and other things, but we want to keep the conversation going. Please add to Padlet. We're going to also queue up and show you that there are some other conversations that are being in the works. Thank you again, Alysa. We want you back. So I'm inviting Alysa back. There's going to be a couple other conversations you'll see that will be posted. One's on 29th of June. Again, these are follow-ups to the Thai newsletter articles. So it's taking the written word and to turn it into spoken dialogue and conversation. There's going to be one hosted on 29th of June. And we're trying to play with these times. So any feedback with times, some might be in the evening because we're trying to watch where folks are in different parts of the world, plus or minus time. And then there's going to be one on the 8th of July. These conversations are going to be ongoing. So this is one of many that we have hosted. They will be throughout the summer. So racism doesn't take a break. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. And again, we're grateful for you all joining us. And then we're going to also have, forgot that, let me post this too. We will have and more information will be coming out soon about this. We have a conference. Again, it's a free conference. It'll be virtual online, 14th, 15th November. Again, information will be sent out. So we just, again, encourage everyone to continue to have these conversations. We are grateful. Again, Alysa, any last words as we close out, Alysa? There is the recording and the slides will be sent to everyone too. So just FYI.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for creating these spaces and the conversation of international schools and how we can begin to dismantle the space that white supremacy and our investment in whiteness, like Sonia Renee talked about, is long overdue. It's long overdue. We are a byproduct of colonialism and we have to reconcile with that. And so I'm just grateful for this space, for this conversation. I dropped my email in the chat. Oops, I dropped it, I think, to everyone. If for continued chat, continued conversations, partnership and collaboration, I think is truly important in this work. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Dr. Ashley, for the space. I'm very humbled and grateful to be here.
Thank you all. And resources that were put into the chat, we will collect those and add those in addition to the doc that you put earlier also, Alysa. So all those resources will be collated and we will send those out with the slides as well as the recording. Thank you all again so much. Have a great day. Have a great afternoon or have a great
evening.
No
yes.
where you are in the world.
Wherever you are. Thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.